This discussion of the history of social welfare in the United States is one that I've done a number of times. I've taught this course across the entire semester, in fact, and so it's a real chore for me to try to compress all of this information into a brief talk, but I'll do my best to get this in under an hour. My name is Bill Galic, and I'm happy to present this information to you. American social welfare has its roots in Judeo-Christian teachings early on, the notion of charity and the provision of relief for the poor, but then it's been modified by its European influences. Its roots include the feudal system, which developed out of the lords providing protective and caretaking role for their farmers, the serf, the community that surrounded their castles, in exchange for food and labor. Eventually, when the feudal system fell apart and many of those farmers found themselves without a means to support themselves, they became wanderers of sorts around Europe. They were known as vagabonds in those days. And out of that period of time, a system for dealing with the needs of those people had to develop because communities were really pressed to provide for the needs of individuals that didn't belong in their communities. The English Poor Laws are one example of a system that was developed in order to address those needs. It spelled out the responsibility for tending to the needy through early taxes and also established restrictions on who could receive care. For instance, the earliest forms of residency requirements indicated that you just couldn't wander into a community and expect to be taken care of. And for those who were from outside the community, there was a system of warning out where those individuals were told that they couldn't stay for very long. Now, some of these restrictions actually found their way into the American system as well. For instance, residency requirements were a hallmark of public assistance programs around the United States until the last few decades. Another thing that came out of this was a differentiation between the worthy and the unworthy poor. The worthy poor being those individuals who couldn't work because they were elderly or because they were disabled, perhaps. The unworthy poor being those who were able-bodied but weren't supporting themselves. The laws that developed in the colonies as individuals began to find their way to America's shores from Europe really reflected the Elizabethan welfare system. Early on, the parish or the town council found themselves responsible for residents in those communities. A system had to develop to assist those communities because they were pressed for funding and the resources needed to care for the poor individual. Those communities who couldn't fund almshouses, which were houses where these individuals might be able to stay, was known as indoor relief in the 1700s, or actually found themselves auctioning off the poor in some cases to individuals who could afford to pay for their keep. And those poor persons tended to be worked very hard in exchange for their keep. And also their children were apprenticed out to artisans. By the end of the colonial period, the responsibility for the poor began to shift from the smaller communities, the towns, to the larger colony or the state. By the end of that century, able-bodied, unemployed persons found themselves in workhouses or almshouses, and by the early 1800s, the primary mode of assistance for those able-bodied unemployed were workhouses, where they had to provide labor in exchange for their care. There was some movement in terms of social services in general in the early 1800s. Dorothea Dix is famous for having advocated for the improved services for the mentally ill and won approval from Congress where they set aside 10 million acres of land in order to fund services for the mentally ill. But Franklin Pierce, who was the 14th president, vetoed the bill, saying that the federal government really didn't have responsibility to tend to the social welfare needs of its population. This particular approach to social welfare on the part of the federal government would continue until the time of the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, almost 100 years later. By the middle of the 1800s, the federal government did begin to acknowledge responsibility in a limited sense for the poor and the needy through a couple of different programs. For one thing, veterans assistance programs began to be established, particularly after the Civil War, where soldiers were compensated for the sacrifices they made during the war, and that has continued until this time. After the Civil War ended, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by the federal government to assist the newly freed slaves in establishing themselves in their communities and in their states. But Congress lost interest in this program, and the Freedmen's Bureau was dissolved in 1872. And after that, very few services for African Americans were provided at all. For the American Indian and Alaska Native population, colonialism reduced the indigenous population in the Americas from an estimated 50 to 100 million at the time of first contact to about 6 million by 1600. And so that population was actually wiped out. 90% of that population was wiped out in the Americas in little more than the first 100 years of European settlers' involvement because of violence, disease, and famine. About 300,000 American Indians were documented to live in the United States around 1900. Now, the 60 to 100 million that we talk about actually involves all of the Americas, but nonetheless, you can still see that there was quite a loss of individuals due to those problems. Part of the process in the European settlers getting established in the United States was really very difficult for the indigenous persons who were here. The Spaniards, for instance, sought permission from their church to punish the American natives for their sins through such measures as rape, justifying this as a deserved punishment because they were considered savage, evil, and rebellious. After 1775, a bounty paid to the colonists for every American Indian Alaska Native scalp handed over to white authorities, and that equated to about $7,300 for each murdered person in today's dollars. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the deaths of over 100,000 Native Americans as the tribes were marched from the south and the east to lands that were less arable and more harsh in the west. This was to allow for the growth of the cotton industry and other industries by the white settlers. This was the famous Trail of Tears that you may be familiar with in your history books. Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote the book about touring America in the early 1800s and marveling at the freedoms that were established in America, commented about the paradox of how the Native Americans were treated as less than human by the federal government in America. Until the advent of the industrial era, later in the 1800s, social services in America really relied upon voluntary association to solve social problems. Essentially, the blame for poverty and human need was placed upon the individual. It was thought that the problems of the individual really involved either individual ignorance, idleness, intemperance, which is drunkenness, or imprudence. And there were aggravating factors that were also felt to be contributing to social problems that included lotteries, pawnbrokers, houses of ill repute, and charitable institutions. So you see, contributing to the aid of individuals was seen as part of the problem. The responsibility for poverty rested with the individual. The solution was believed to be in institutions, and so special institutions and services were created in the 1840s, 1850s, in that era in order to address the problems that existed in American society. There was a large influx of immigrants, mostly from Europe during this period of time, and more so later in this period of time, the 1890 to 1920 period. And there was also quite a migration of rural individuals from farms to the cities through the 1930s and before that time. The Great Migration, which is identified in the history of African Americans as a time when Southern blacks moved to the north and the northeast, actually began around the turn of the 1900s and continued well into the middle of the 20th century. But as the Industrial Revolution changed the face of America, a number of new issues arose. For instance, protection for women in the workplace, which began in the early 1900s, and child labor restrictions and compulsory education laws also developed during this period of time, essentially not so much to protect women and to protect children as it was to support the economy by making more jobs available to adult males. 10 out of 12 workers were affected by industrial accidents in this early era of industrialization, but there was no workers' comp or disability insurance or unemployment insurance at all during this particular period, and so if you were hurt on the job, you were just out of luck for income. Political machines, graft, corruption ran rampant in society and ruled much of the business world. And the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s, saw the emergence of muckraker journalism exposing the problems in society. You may remember reading about the muckrakers in your American history classes in high school. Northern industry recruited Southern blacks to serve as strikebreakers during periods when worker unionization began to take hold around the turn of the last century as well. There was an attitude of social Darwinism that took place in the 1800s and continued well into the 1900s. And this essentially indicated that if competition for scarce resources was nature's law, as Darwin said, then the poor suffer only because they can't compete in society. This philosophy goes, the wealthy are entitled to their spoils because of their fitness, and aiding the poor, and for that matter, allowing their reproduction, altered nature's laws and weakened the human gene pool. It was during this period of time when the science of eugenics, which was that system devoted to improving the human race through genetic manipulation, became very popular. The extreme version of eugenics began to show itself during the Nazi era in Germany later in this period of time. According to social Darwinists, aiding the needy thwarted the evolutionary progress of humankind, and so aiding the needy was considered to be a bad thing as far as social Darwinism was concerned. Religious institutions really were turned to provide relief for the poor. Through their lens, poverty was seen as a moral failure. Work was a duty of God-fearing persons. This reaches back into Calvinistic philosophies from Europe, where hard work and little play was the way of living one's life in a holy fashion. If an individual was successful, then economic success was really seen as God's favor. And this promoted the work-oriented society and really gave a lot of backing to the notion that no one else was responsible for caring for the poor, certainly not the government. The earliest social workers were untrained, were largely volunteer, mostly middle and upper class women, oftentimes connected to a church. They had the belief that the poor had to be taught to live moral lives, so their work focused more upon spiritual guidance, and if any aid was given, it wasn't any kind of cash assistance, and it would have been tied to demands such as abstinence from alcohol and other kinds of things that would lead these individuals to a better life. The charity organization societies were formed in the 1870s because there were a lot of different charitable organizations out there providing duplication of services, and there was also a lot of corruption and graft in those agencies, and so the idea of the COSs was to monitor and to coordinate these agencies through their efforts. Out of this COS movement came the friendly visitor, early forerunners of social workers who conducted investigation into the client's life and provided instruction to the poor on how to better manage themselves. Again, the idea was planted that it was all about individual fault, this idea of poverty. Beneficent charity was seen as counterproductive and contributing to their dependency and laziness. Interestingly, although the COSs were opposed to providing any kind of cash assistance and what we call direct relief to the poor, their studies inadvertently contributed to social research about poverty and helped to establish the fact that poverty had more to do with society and less to do with individual fault. As for children, the Children's Aid Society was formed during this period of time as part of what was known as the child saving movement. And among other things, the society would rescue these orphans of the individuals in almshouses and workhouses or kids that were running the streets, and would send those orphans to the West by train, putting them on farms with families that actually needed free labor to help get themselves established. And so the idea was the children were being assisted and taught how to work and to live moral lives, and if settlement was established in the West more effectively because of that, so be it. Another aspect of social work during this period of time was the settlement house movement, which began in the 1880s. And these homes, mostly in urban settings, were attempts to work across class differences to help neighborhoods organize and provide education and literacy classes. Services were focused primarily upon the poor and immigrant communities in the cities, and teaching English was one of those things that was a part of the settlement house movement. The largely middle class and wealthy women would actually move to these communities, live in these settlement houses, and to assist the individuals from the neighborhood. And this gave workers insight and knowledge into the social and economic conditions of American cities. The settlement house movement was the part of the origins of social work that focused upon social advocacy and upon the notion that social reform was more important than individual change. The most famous of these was Hull House in Chicago, which was established by Jane Addams in 1889. Still, Hull House remained segregated by race until the 1930s. African Americans were again left to their own devices, more or less, and so associations sprung up to serve their needs because of the absence of government interventions. And in fact, the profession of social work as a whole largely ignored the needs of blacks. So African Americans had fraternal organizations and mutual aid societies to turn to. And there were some black settlement houses that were established to assist during the Great Migration that I referred to earlier. Also, this included the development of what we now call HBCs, historically black colleges, to serve rural African Americans. And some social reform organizations such as the NAACP and the Urban League had their roots in these early movements for social change by the African American community. The Dawes Act of 1887, which is also known as the General Allotment Act of that period of time, was established by the federal government to regulate the land rights on tribal territories within the United States. And this law subdivided Native American tribal communal landholding into allotments for Native American heads of families and individuals. Land ownership was not something that was a part of the ethos and the culture of Native Americans, but the federal government was intent upon assimilating Native Americans. This converted traditional systems of land tenure into a government-imposed system of private property, forcing the Native Americans to assume this capitalistic, proprietary relationship with property that did not exist before that time. And before private property would be dispensed, the government had to determine which Indians were eligible for allotments, and this fueled an official search for a federal definition of what it meant to be an Indian. Only those Native Americans who accepted land under this act became U.S. citizens during this period of time. The peculiar thing, of course, the Native Americans weren't considered citizens for still for many more years, but those who accepted allotments under this act did begin to gain citizenship. What lands were left, and this is estimated to be about 2/3 of the American Indian Alaska Native land, was lost to white settlers. Those lands were declared surplus and were made available to sell to non-natives. The federal government and the Bureau of Indian Affairs realized that they couldn't actually remove American Indian persons from the country, and so the policy they adopted was that of assimilation. And there were a number of efforts that were made in order to assimilate American Indians, the Dawes Act being the start of this, I think. But in the last few decades of the 1800s, the boarding school era began. The first one, I believe, was the Hampton Institute, which was originally established, I believe, to educate children of slaves, but began to also be used to house Native Americans. The Carlisle Indian Boarding School in Pennsylvania was also one of the first and became rather infamous, in fact, because of the documented abuses that went on in that school. And the intent was to civilize the young persons into Christian values and a Protestant work ethic. The philosophy of the founders of the school was kill the Indian and save the man. Children in these schools were punished for practicing their religion, for speaking their language, for using their birth names, for having long hair, all these cultural things that they were used to. And oftentimes the parents were coerced into placing children in the homes, threatened with imprisonment if they didn't do that, and oftentimes were not allowed to visit the children. And this was some of the earliest efforts on the part of the federal government to remove Indian children from the families. Again, another issue that wouldn't even begin to be addressed for another 100 years. In Alaska, the first boarding school that was established by Americans was in Sitka in 1878 by Presbyterian missionaries. But in the decades that were to follow, boarding schools opened all across Alaska, operated by a variety of different Christian missionaries and denominations, until around the turn of the 20th century, when many of these schools were taken over by the federal government. And all during this time, many Alaska Native children were sent outside of Alaska to Indian residential schools, such as the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which really had no understanding of the culture from which these children originated. In the first part of the 1900s, the Progressive Era occurred, and this grew out of some of the reforms that were instituted by Teddy Roosevelt in the business world. Also because of the publishing of the muckrakers in such books as, for instance, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which again exposed the social conditions that workers were living in. This all was going on in the context of a spreading socialism movement all around the world. In the early 1900s, of course, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar, but that was just the tip of the iceberg. And socialism, in many ways, permeated throughout Europe and became popular in the United States, the most popular it had ever been in the United States during this period of time. There were candidates who were running for president that were seen by the establishment as being quite a threat to the capitalist economy in America. The response was, let's do something to try to settle everyone down here. And so a number of different reforms began to occur, which illustrated the Progressive Era. You won't be surprised to know that there was a conservative backlash to the progressive era reforms, but the Great Depression, when it arrived in the late 1920s, turned all of that on its heels, and the government all of a sudden became the source of aid for the needy in a large way. Herbert Hoover was president at the time of the Great Depression when it began, and he was reluctant to involve the federal government in direct relief. He believed a lot upon individual effort and voluntary organizations, and he focused upon propping up businesses as a way to put the nation back on its feet. Such organizations as the Red Cross was leaned upon by Hoover to resolve human needs. In fact, I believe they made him their president during this period. The great needs of the nation during the Great Depression soon exhausted the voluntary sector's funding. Franklin Roosevelt was elected by a landslide in 1932, and he promised a New Deal to address the collapse of the economy and had a number of aid programs and reforms for both the business community and the individuals that he attempted to implement early in his administration. His first 100 days, in fact, are famous for the reforms that he instituted, and every president's first 100 days since then have been judged against FDR's first 100 days. He declared a bank holiday to begin with, which was based upon the fact that a lot of people had lost confidence in the economic system and were withdrawing their money from the banks, which of course only exacerbated the economic problems. And so he closed the banks for a few days and also established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which was an organization that promised to insure the deposits individuals made with banks. A couple of agencies were implemented, one to provide emergency relief to the states and local communities, and another to provide public work projects and also to provide some federal control over the work sites. But the Supreme Court declared parts of both of them unconstitutional and forced changes in the program. And so Roosevelt was really struggling with a conservative Supreme Court in the early days of his attempts to pick the economy up. But Congress did enact several programs which became known as the New Deal, and here's a list of those without going into them in great detail. Some of them you're familiar with: the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was to provide repair, refinancing, and new mortgages; the Agricultural Adjustment Act, to actually provide support to farmers, limiting production and distributing surplus foods to the needy. This is the early forerunner of the food stamp or SNAP program, but the intent was to stabilize farm prices and to help the farmers. FDIC, I mentioned earlier. The National Youth Authority put young Americans to work. The Civilian Conservation Corps employed men 18 to 25 in conservation activities around the nation. Now you notice a lot of the focus is upon male employment, reflecting the times and the ideas of the time. Works Progress Administration, the WPA, provided funding for skilled and educated individuals to be employed in a variety of different projects around the nation, major art projects, construction projects, and those kinds of things. This was the alternative to one of the programs that the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional a few years earlier. If you ever spend time in the lower 48, and particularly around old college campuses and things like that, you'll see some of these old WPA buildings. They're just beautiful, beautiful buildings that will probably stand for the next 300 years. They're just so solidly built. And the Social Security Act of 1935, providing benefits to workers and families, which was the alternative to the other program that the Supreme Court had declared unconstitutional. Reforms in the workplace, the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike were awarded to workers during this period of time. Workers' compensation, which was largely established through the states, but that also became more common, was supported during the Roosevelt administration. If you were injured on the job, the employer had an insurance program that would provide income to you in part while you recovered from your injuries. And the Fair Labor Standards Act, which also continues to still be in effect, which at the time provided for a 44-hour work week, and that anyone who worked more than that amount of time had to be paid overtime pay. And that's now 40 hours. Of course, the standard work week is 40 hours in most places. A minimum wage was established for the first time, and child labor was finally, once and for all, outlawed, with restrictions placed upon the ages that children could be employed and how many hours they could work if they were still in school. Now to the Social Security Act. That was the last of the New Deal programs I had mentioned a few slides back. And this is really the crowning achievement of the New Deal and is, in part at least, still around and vestiges of it. Although so many efforts have been made by the conservative leadership since this time to do away with the Social Security Act and all its changes, by and large, it remains today. And there are three primary parts of the Social Security Act: federal social insurance for workers, federal to state categorical assistance, and maternal and child welfare. The one that you're probably most familiar with is number one, the federal social insurance for workers. And that included old age and survivors insurance. So you see the years that they were established, first of all, for retirement, and then also for the people who survived, those who did retire, who had an income through Social Security. And in 1956, Social Security disability was added so that if an individual became disabled and could no longer work and they were certified as disabled, Social Security would pay them as though they had retired. And in 65, Medicare was added, and that provided health insurance for the elderly and disabled. Also, this included unemployment compensation when an individual was laid off from work or was not let go of for just cause. The government had a program to provide partial income for a period of time. Setting aside the unemployment compensation and Medicare, this is what we now know as Social Security. Old age and survivors and disability. In the olden days when you would get paychecks, oftentimes this deduction was OASDI, old age survivors disability. Now it's just, now we have a separate Medicare deduction, and you probably have a Social Security deduction also. You contribute to a fund for Social Security when you retire based upon the years of service. You have to work for 40 quarters or 10 years of substantial contributions. Based upon the years of your service and how much you contributed, then you get a check back from the federal government when you do retire in your 60s. We tend to think of this as not being a public welfare program because we tend to believe that we're getting our money back. This is money we deposited, but that's not how it is. And just to be honest with you, this is a social welfare program. It's a retirement program that ensures that the elderly have an income, something that we didn't have before, makes them less dependent upon the government, and they can live longer and have a healthier life. You're not getting your money back. Your checks are coming from the contributions being made by the current workforce. So just keep that in mind. But don't try to tell a Social Security recipient they're getting welfare because they might slug you in the face. The second part of the Social Security Act, as I mentioned here, is the federal to state categorical assistance. And you have to look at what it says. The federal government's giving money to the states for certain categories of assistance. Old age assistance, aid to the blind, and aid to dependent children. First, old age assistance and aid to the blind. Now, if you remember, the first part had old age insurance there and also a disability insurance, as you'll see. You see here old age and aid to the blind really is a disability and also a retirement income. And this is for those individuals who did not work those 40 quarters or 10 years that are required to qualify for Social Security. In the early days in particular, nobody had made contributions into the system, and so it was some time before an individual actually had accumulated enough contributions to the system to qualify for Social Security itself. This is considered to be essentially a basic income for individuals who were elderly and didn't have a retirement, and blind individuals as well. And then aid to the permanently and totally disabled was added in 1950. Medicaid, which is the corollary health insurance program to Medicare, was added in this category. And in 1974, aid to the blind, disabled, and old age assistance was all federalized and became Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. You may be familiar with SSI as well. This is government assistance for the disabled and, in some cases, retired individuals who have not contributed to the Social Security system. SSI provides a basic, and it is a very basic, monthly income to those individuals. The aid to dependent children was originally called ADC, then became, in the 1950s, when the caretaker was added to the grant, became AFDC, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children. And during the Clinton era and welfare reform in the 1990s, it became Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. In Alaska, that's known as ATAP, Alaska Temporary Assistance Program. This, of course, is the program that is typically thought of as welfare, and the unemployed mother is the focus of a lot of public attention on this, and often the focus of some derision by the public. And I just encourage you to read up on the conditions of individuals who are receiving TANF benefits today, and you can see there's a lot of reasons why women may have to remain on TANF for some time because of the way the workforce is structured. The last part of the Social Security Act was the maternal and child welfare, and provided programs for the care of homeless, dependent, and neglected children. Eventually, doctors began to recognize signs of chronic abuse of children. The Child protection programs was established through state legislation, mostly in the 1960s and beyond. It kind of evolved from this particular part of the Social Security Act. Crippled children's services and also public health programs also were a part of this. They continue to exist today. A couple footnotes on this. First of all, the ADC program I was mentioning earlier was originally intended to be a program that was designed to allow moms to stay home and care for their kids rather than work. Get that? The idea was moms would stay home and take care for their kids, and it would be okay. That was the original intention, but it became an unpopular concept and was put under the Department of Labor rather than in Health and Social Services. And so the focus became the unemployed status of the parent rather than focusing on the needs of children. Secondly, the one thing that was originally in the Social Security Act and was taken out, universal health care. Intense lobbying by organizations such as the American Medical Association had it taken out of the package. And mind you, the AMA continues to lobby against socialized medicine now. The latest we hear now is, I think we call it Medicare for All, as Bernie Sanders' moniker for it. The AMA tends to struggle against this and was also one of the major forces that pushed back on the Bill Clinton administration's efforts to establish national health care in the 1990s. I'll have more on that in a few moments. And continues to press against it. Goodness knows why. You'll hear all sorts of claims that our system is superior to all the socialized medicine systems in the world, but we're one of the few nations in the world, industrialized or otherwise, that doesn't guarantee basic health care for its citizens. And we should be ashamed of that. Universal health care is working all around the world in various different forms. There is actually paid efforts to convince us that those systems are deficient, including the Canadian system. So don't believe everything you hear about this. After World War II, there was a new Red Scare. We were allies with the Soviet Union during the war, and as soon as the war was over, quickly we became in opposition to the Soviet Union, and communism was considered an evil. There was a Red Scare in government and industry after World War II that resulted in the repression of the progressive reforms that were evident in the New Deal. And so AFTC and Social Security expanded some in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, but virtually no new welfare programming has been proposed since. Now, the Biden administration's recent proposals may be some of the first significant proposals in this direction since this time. In 1962, Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. I have it in a list of references at the end of this presentation. Dispelled a myth that most Americans had in the 1950s, which is relatively an economically stable time, that we were all living in unsurpassed comfort. And he pointed to a large subculture of poverty in America, and of course that subculture continues to exist today. Civil rights saw a lot of progress in the 1950s, first with Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, which ordered the orderly desegregation of schools, and on into the 1960s. But since that time, there's been a good deal of regression in more recent court rulings that have undermined voting rights and has restricted affirmative action programs. The women's rights movement has become more active again, particularly in the 1960s, with the advent of such things as ready access to birth control methods, separating sex from pregnancy for women for the first time. For all women. It really had a lot to do with the changing of the patriarchal structure of family life, and this began to be challenged in the 1960s. But in the 1940s to 1960s, during that period of time, federal tribal recognition of over 100 tribes and their sovereignty was terminated. This is called the Termination Era if you look into Native American history. And the effort was intended to assimilate, to disband these tribes. Several larger tribes survived this effort, by the way, but many of them did not. And the effort was to disband these tribes and to take away all their special protections in order to assimilate Native Americans into the American system and the American economy. Now, there wasn't really anything done to help them get into the American economy through economics or anything like this. I guess the idea was they would just find their way into it. Ultimately, these policies were abandoned beginning in the late 1960s. During the Lyndon Johnson administration in 1968, I believe, finally recognition and sovereignty was restored to most all of these tribes. Alaska, of course, comes into the Union in 1959, and the Alaska Federation of Natives formed before that time in order to continue to advance the cause of Alaska Natives during the process of statehood and beyond. And AFN lobbied for a Fair Lands Claims Settlement Act, which resulted in the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, which was to provide the state with land promised in gaining statehood and the natives with a 40 million acre land base. And out of that 40 million acres, 13 regional corporations were formed. The villages only owned the surface of the selected lands in their communities. The minerals located below the surface belonged to the regional corporations, and so that funded the operation of these corporations. Some of those corporations are doing very well financially, others not so well. But in the process of ANCSA, sovereignty of those Alaska Native tribes was extinguished and all Aboriginal rights were subjected to state law. This, of course, continues to be the source of a great deal of contention and disagreement, and this is an emerging issue that I think we'll see change in the future. Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, or the Great Society, the War on Poverty was a part of his vision of a great society, attempted to address the problems of poverty through a variety of different programs. And again, a list of them are here, some of which survive today, others mostly in modified form. Job Corps, for instance, is just a shadow of what it was in the Johnson administration. But the idea was for most of these organizations, such as the Office of Economic Opportunity, to enlist the maximum feasible participation of the poor in these programs. But that really failed, in part because local politicians, uncooperative bureaucrats, and ineffective community leaderships all colluded to do away with the notion of community-led administration of these programs. But nonetheless, during the 1960s, the percentage of people living in poverty in America fell from 25% to about 12%. A lot of this has to do with Medicare and Medicaid, and also the implementation of the federalized income programs through the Social Security Act. There were a lot of progressive rulings during the 1960s into the early 1970s by the Supreme Court during the Earl Warren Court years, and gave the promise of expanding civil rights. It included the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination based on religion, race, sex, or national origin, including in voter registration and in schools and workplace. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 also cut down barriers that were being erected, particularly throughout the South, to prevent African Americans from voting. And some of these protections that were established by this Voting Rights Act of 1965 were struck down by the Supreme Court, a more conservative Supreme Court, in 2013. Medicare and Medicaid established, food stamp program, which grew out of the supplemental food programs of the New Deal. Now it's the SNAP program. Began then. Again, remember, this had a lot to do with supporting farmers. The food stamp program, the SNAP program, yes, it puts healthy food on the tables of the poor that wouldn't be there otherwise. And there's no question that it's a benefit to families. But it also is a major force in our economy. It supports the farms that produce those foods that those poor people eat. It supports the truckers who transport the food from the farm to the stores where you can purchase it. It supports the stores that sell the food and the workers in those stores, and on and on and on. You see, when there are efforts to cut back on SNAP benefits, or for that matter, TANF benefits, all of these programs have a much, much larger impact on the greater economy than conservatives want you to understand. And it would be a ripple effect that would hurt everybody in the nation if these programs were scaled back. And you can see other programs implemented here for older Americans, discrimination in housing, Social Security Act amendments, Mental Health Act to establish community mental health centers around the United States. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968 finally gave tribal members the rights to a jury trial to assemble to petition. These are the Bill of Rights that didn't apply involving Native Americans and their lands. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, which perhaps began to correct, at least it was an effort to try to correct some of the placement issues where Indian children are removed from their home and their cultural communities and placed with white families. And this directs placement priorities for Indian children removed from their homes. And a number of Supreme Court decisions also extended rights to individuals, including Miranda, Galt, which provided protections for juveniles in the system, the same protections that adults would have in a criminal system. Loving versus Virginia, which outlawed discrimination, which outlawed laws in states which prohibited interracial marriages. Roe versus Wade, which of course you're familiar with. All these protections are under threat with a conservative leadership and conservative federal courts. they're not guaranteed to last. There has been a retreat from progressive changes since the 1960s, and power and money has been shifted to the states under the Nixon administration and the Reagan administration. Nixon did, interestingly, propose a basic family income program called the Family Assistance Plan, which suggested that every family should have a basic income guaranteed. Congress wouldn't approve it, but the federalization of federal to state categorical assistance programs under Social Security may be a response to that, where it does provide something of a guaranteed income to the individual, although not totally so. Reagan really subscribed to trickle-down theories of economics, which tells you basically if you put the money in the hands of the wealthy, they'll create industry, they'll create jobs, and the benefits of that money going to the wealthy will trickle down to the common working man and to the poor person. Thus, all of the tax cuts you see in conservative administrations, the tax cuts primarily focus upon the wealthy and not upon the worker or the poor person. Religious forces also became much close to federal power thanks to the moral majority during the Reagan administration and really influenced his leadership with its cultural conservatism. And in the process of this, homelessness increased dramatically in the Reagan era. Real income fell, jobs were lost, and were replaced by low-wage service industry jobs, most of which are non-union in nature. Bill Clinton becomes president, and 2 years after he is president, and Clinton was a centrist Democrat to begin with, but 2 years after he was elected, there was a backlash against the election of a Democrat, I suppose, and the Republicans took over Congress in 1994. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House during this period of time and proposed the Contract with America, which had a very punitive and restrictive effort to reform and punish poor people through a number of different programs. Gingrich, among other things, proposed that rather than paying cash payments to women on welfare, to just take their children and put them in institutions, put them in orphanages, hearkening back to the philosophies of the 1840s when institutions were seen to be the cure for individual fault. Welfare reform that was implemented during this period of time, Clinton had promised to end welfare as we know it, but perhaps this became more punitive than he wanted to see and attached all sorts of lifestyle demands to the provision of assistance. It placed lifetime limits on how long assistance could be received. Now, the states do have the capacity to grant exceptions to those limits, I believe, for 20% of their population, determined by the states as to who gets exempted. There was an attempt to pass a comprehensive health care reform program, national health insurance, that was led by Hillary Clinton as the First Lady, and that failed largely because of the AMA and healthcare industry in general opposing it. I believe this is where much of the reluctance to be supportive of Hillary Clinton began, as much of America didn't like having a strong woman leading an effort when she wasn't elected to lead any effort at all. Although the effort was a noble effort and she led it appropriately and would have helped us establish a good healthcare system, this backlash kept it out of our society once again. Also implemented during this period of time, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell and Defense of Marriage Act, both of which were eventually overturned by the Supreme Court in the early 2000s, were policies that were signed by Bill Clinton under pressure from a Congress that was threatening to propose constitutional amendment to define marriage as between one man and one woman. Clinton said that he wasn't supportive, for instance, of the Defense of Marriage Act, which says that marriage is between a man and a woman. DOMA was eventually overturned by Congress and allowed for same-sex marriage nationally. Clinton said that he knew that if he didn't sign this bill, there was such strong conservative efforts in Congress at the time and around the nation that it was very likely that Congress would propose a constitutional amendment to institutionalize marriage as between one man and one woman. And it would be much harder to overcome if indeed a constitutional amendment was implemented. And so he signed the law, he says, in retrospect, hoping that someday it might be overturned, and indeed it was. George W. Bush in the early 2000s managed to get a lot of voters to the polls because his political advisors saw to it that local ballots had votes about either defense of marriage or gay and lesbian rights, so that it would bring these conservative voters to the polls. There's a lot of thinking that this is why George Bush was elected. So there was a higher turnout among conservatives and religious voters as a result of this strategy. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq dominated his budget during the Bush years and would have undermined any social programming that he might have considered. He was advocating for the privatization of the Social Security and was perhaps thankfully directed away from that because of his focus upon these wars. Trillions of dollars spent on these two wars that might otherwise have been spent on social service needs in America. And Bush supported the faith-based organizations providing services. His father, George H.W. Bush, famously referred to volunteerism as 1,000 points of light. Under Obama, there's a lot of people who expected that Obama would be more progressive than he was, and it took him some time to get there. But he did do a few things that moved the needle forward. The Lilly Ledbetter Act provided for more time for women to file equal pay suits, and you should research that. I don't really have time to explain it, but it was a good step for protection of equal pay rights for women. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was the stimulus package as a result of the economic collapse in 2007, and the bailouts of Wall Street and the auto industry, kept those institutions going during a very, very difficult financial time. Of course, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was signed into law in 2010, and this included the expansion of Medicaid, made it available to more persons with higher income levels, not high incomes, but higher income levels. He appointed 2 women to the Supreme Court and tried to appoint a moderate to the Supreme Court in his last year in office, but of course that was blocked by Congress. And marriage equality was established when the Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. Donald Trump made efforts to scrap just about anything associated with Barack Obama during his presidency, including the Affordable Care Act, and was trying very hard to dismantle its provisions, and succeeded to a certain extent. His appointments to the federal courts and to the Supreme Court have been very, very conservative, and at the present time, the Supreme Court is 6-3 in favor of conservatives. Supportive of states' efforts to restrict or complicate access to abortion, it is very likely that will be brought back before the Supreme Court at one point or another. Roe v. Wade will be reviewed because the states are treading on what the law says in an effort to get it before the court. Efforts to pull back requirements for provision of free birth control for employees, environmental regulations, of course, money spent on building the wall. On the plus side, there's pandemic relief in 2020, payments to individuals and loans to businesses and fundings for personal protective equipment and that kind of thing. And then the CARES Act late in Trump's administration, which again provided more payments to individuals for COVID relief. Payments for food programs to supplement those who have been unemployed because of the pandemic. Loans to businesses, funds to Indian health services, mental health, substance abuse services, and so on. Since Joe Biden has been elected, his efforts have been to push us back in a more progressive social service direction. And you can see here the American Rescue Plan was passed on very partisan lines, but was passed in the first month or so of his administration, providing relief again to individuals for COVID relief, expanding unemployment benefits again. And I will say the CARES Act also, or perhaps it was the first pandemic relief bill in 2020, under the Trump administration, provided for up to $600 a week and expanded unemployment benefits for a period of time. Biden is also working to increase the child tax credit and expanding the earned income tax credit, increasing the child care credit. You see, the idea being basically to put more money into the hands of families with children, and his other 2 proposals, both of which remain very much in negotiation with Congress as of the time that I'm recording this. He would really very much like to see some permanent changes in our tax structure and the income structure to provide more support for families through these programs. So time will tell what happens there. So in closing, I just want to take a quote from one of the sources I have here in the next slide, Phyllis Day, who wrote a book called A New History of Social Welfare. And it's a textbook that I've leaned very heavily upon for information in this presentation, as well as in my social welfare class. She made a point that I think is very worthwhile, and that is that when rebellion threatens, the response is first accommodation, and then, when the force of the movement is dissipated, renewed denial. And this explains the history of social welfare in the United States, which is, as she describes it, a pendulum swing between provision of social services and taking care of the needy to a backlash against that and withdrawal of those services. And she says that what pushes us towards providing for the needs of individuals is the threat of rebellion. And the threat of rebellion may not actually be people taking up arms, but it may be more things like economic collapse. You look at what happened, for instance, as a response to the labor strikes and to the economic problems in the early 1900s. That resulted in the Progressive Era. The Depression resulted in the New Deal. Then the Great Society came in. There was a conservative backlash against the Great Society. There was the economic collapse in 2007. You had a stimulus package in the Obama program, Trump response to that. Now in the response to the pandemic, Biden's coming forward again with more social service programs. So you see this back and forth in our history in funding for these services. And it just makes me wonder if we're ever going to get to the point where, like in most of the European nations, for instance, we're ever going to get to the point where we just have a value that allows us to care for children and families consistently and without shame and without stigma. It is certainly within our ability to do that if we align our values such to allow it. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this was useful to you. Here is a suggested list of readings and also references that I use. There are many other books out there as well that are very helpful for understanding this information more. But these are ones that I would suggest you look at. Thank you very much.